Okay, so in this video, I'm going to talk about P.F. Strawson's Freedom and Resentment. This was published in the 60s, but it's a really famous paper. It's one of the most sort of cited papers in the last 100 years, I think, in philosophy. So if you continue to study philosophy after this class, you'll definitely have to read it again. And if not, you'll certainly see it cited quite frequently. It's also a very dense paper. It's a fairly complicated paper, so we're not going to cover every aspect. And I also recommend that you really take your time while reading it. This is the paper that might even warrant a couple readings. I know that that's a lot to ask people, but if you're really interested in sort of getting a real grip on it, it might be worth your time. Okay, so let's get into it. Basically, it's an account where he lays out his theory of reactive attitudes. And we're going to talk about how this relates to our practices of blaming people or holding them morally responsible. This is sort of the meat of why I think this paper is relevant for this module. But before we get into that, there's a few sort of background or framing ideas that we need to cover. First, it's important to understand what he's responding to with this paper so we can sort of understand how it's situated within a much broader debate. And what he's responding to is this concept of determinism. So very briefly, determinism is the idea that all actions and events are determined by previous actions and events, and that this great causal chain of events is outside of direct human control. It's outside of agentic control, specifically. So to sort of visualize this, you might think of a massive row of dominoes. So as soon as the first domino starts to fall, a chain is set in motion that makes it inevitable that all of the dominoes connected in that chain are going to fall. They don't have a choice in whether they fall or not because something a long time ago before them was set into motion that determined the outcome. So determinism is often understood as meaning that humans do not have free will, at least not in the way that we think we do. And this is seen as making a problem for our practices of praising and blaming. Basically, the idea is that if we don't have free will, then how can we really hold people responsible for what they do if they didn't choose to do it? So questions about determinism and free will and moral responsibility, these are huge questions in philosophy. And we are going to kind of skirt by that big debate, which I think is really interesting. And I'm happy to talk about those ideas more if any of you want to reach out. But we're going to kind of skirt by that big debate on the way to talking about Strawson's account of blame. But just know that that's sort of what he's responding to. So many philosophers took this issue of determinism and said, okay, if determinism is true, what does this mean for moral responsibility? So Strawson takes a different approach. He said, instead, let's look at our practices of praise and blame. Let's look at what we already do, and let's see what this tells us about responsibility. And he starts by emphasizing the importance of our reactive attitudes. And our reactive attitudes are basically responses that we have to other people. So they include feelings like forgiveness and love and gratitude. And he argues that these are essential to our interpersonal lives and our moral practices. He says that even if these aren't justified or aren't rational, or determinism says that they're not rational to do, they are so essential to our interpersonal practices as human beings that we just can't get rid of them. Essentially, he says they function as a kind of psychological necessity for sort of being human. And he argues that holding others responsible for their actions is really nothing more than just manifesting certain kinds of reactive attitudes towards them. So to view someone as responsible for some good act or accomplishment is simply to manifest feelings of approval towards them. Those are the same thing to him. So to view someone responsible for an act in a negative sense, so to see them as blameworthy, is equal to manifesting feelings like resentment towards them. And resentment is something he spends a lot of time on. So he spends a lot of time on the following questions. When are we justified in resenting or blaming another? And the simplest version is that he says we are justified in blaming others when they manifest ill will towards us. And there's a number of considerations that he makes that makes this picture much more nuanced and more complicated. But what is important to note from the start of Strawson's account is that intention is really important. So the sort of meaning that you imbue with your acts, the sort of psychological intention, the feelings behind the act are really important to Strawson. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. So when talking about resentment, Strawson focuses on two types of considerations that you might make on behalf of someone who has done some wrong. The offending party is what we'll say. So two types of considerations you might make on behalf of an offending party that would make it inappropriate to blame them for wrongdoing or injury. And the first type of considerations allow us to maintain a view of the agent as in general responsible for their actions. And instead it asks that we view the wrongdoing or the injury in question as one for which that person is not fully responsible. So these types of considerations might involve, he says, the use of phrases like, he didn't mean to, he didn't realize, he didn't know, or he couldn't help it. And when we make these kinds of considerations, we still view the agent with what Strawson calls the participant attitude. And this is important to his view. So the participant attitude means that we view them as a fellow moral agent. And we think that they are the proper object of what he says, the kinds of demand for goodwill or regard, which is reflected in ordinary attitudes. So we think they're the right kind of person that we can say, we can make moral demands of them. And in these cases, these sort of considerations, the fact of the injury is sort of, we don't see it as inconsistent with making demands of goodwill for this person. And instead we see the injury as a result of an accident or ignorance on the part of the agent. So we don't see them as like sort of fully connected to the act. So these are sort of focused on making some sort of separation between the agent and the act. So you might think like you are like sitting on the floor doing your yoga routine and your roommate is on the phone and doesn't look down and walks into the house and accidentally steps on your hand. And it hurts, but you know that they didn't mean to and it was an accident. And so even though it did hurt you, you're not going to hold them as sort of blameworthy for it because it was an accident. So the second group of considerations involves a more agent-focused approach. And in these cases, we call the agent's capacity for responsibility into question. So specifically, the second group of considerations, Strawson says, and I quote, invite us to suspend our ordinary reactive attitudes towards the agent, either at the time of his action or all the time. So at the time of the action and all the time, he sort of divides this consideration into two subgroups. So there's a lot of like dividing in this essay, which is why it gets complicated. But in the first subgroup, we are asked to view the agent sort of in a different light from the light in which we should normally view one who has acted as he has acted. That's a quote from Strawson. One primary example of this might be to understand the agent as under extraordinary or abnormal stress. So another example, say a friend snaps at you. They say something really mean or harsh, but you happen to know that this friend, they're under a lot of pressure at work. They have a very stressful job. In addition to that, their mom is really sick, and you know that their car actually broke down that morning, and they are really just having a very rough time. And so in that case, though they said something that usually you would find really objectionable, usually you would say, that is morally wrong, you shouldn't treat me that way. In this instance, because of all these considerations, because of the kind of abnormal stress that they're under, you might be saying, listen, I'll just let it slide because I know that you're really kind of going through it. So in other words, we might think that we shouldn't have the same kind of reactive attitudes that we would normally have, the same kind of resentment feelings or whatever, towards that agent as we would if they had acted under more typical circumstances. So the second subgroup, which Strawson identifies as the more important one, invites us to view the agent themselves as sort of abnormal in some relevant way. So in general, in cases like these, we might understand the agent as morally underdeveloped, or as Strawson says, psychologically abnormal in some sense. So this might include considerations like them being a child, or being maybe mentally ill in a way that directly affects their moral decision-making capacities. So according to Strawson, quote, when we see someone in such a light as this, all our reactive attitude tends to be profoundly modified. So it makes a huge difference to us how we view the sort of general approach we have towards another. So cases like this, argues Strawson, might lead someone to displace their ordinary reactive attitudes and what he calls the participant attitude towards the other, and instead adopt what he calls the objective attitude, which involves viewing the agent more like as an object of social policy or a subject for treatment, he says. And this prevents interpersonal involvement that the participatory reactive attitudes allow for. So the objective attitude involves sort of removing yourself from this more interpersonal relationship with another person. It involves caring less what they think of you. And it also involves seeing that they are perhaps not the kind of person that you can make moral demands of, or expect, goodwill from overall, because there's something about how they're psychologically constituted that makes it so that those demands would be unreasonable. So, like if a toddler says to you, I hate you, you're probably not going to take that seriously or personally, or it would maybe be unreasonable for you to manifest feelings, these reactive attitudes like resentment towards the child, because what you might instead think is that, well, they're not psychologically or morally developed enough to even know that that's wrong or be able to act differently than how they really did. Okay, so let's try to recap with a very quick summary. One, let's say he says we are psychologically disposed to have a ton of reactive attitudes towards the people that we find ourselves in interpersonal contact with, and these, we can't get rid of them. Whether they're reasonable or not, we're sort of stuck with them. And these sort of make up our moral judgments of praise and blame. So our blaming practices are made up of these reactive attitudes. The appropriateness of our blame, or whether or not we react by blaming someone or becoming angry, is related to how we view them and what general, more broad attitude we take towards them. So in order to see someone as the appropriate object of our reactive attitudes, we have to take the participant attitude towards them, meaning we have to see them as capable of manifesting things like goodwill towards us. We have to see them as being possibly responsive to our claims, and we have to see them as a more fully developed moral agent. But finally, there are a bunch of considerations we can make which might make it inappropriate to blame them. So some of these considerations, when someone has done something wrong, might involve still viewing them with the participant attitude, but saying that they didn't mean to, or sort of drawing some disconnect between who they are and what they did. But some more deeper reason for not blaming someone involves seeing them as just never really an appropriate object for our reactive attitudes, because there's something about their psychological or moral development that makes us adopt the objective attitude towards them.